shellfish, including raw oysters are another one. So these are the high-risk foods that we're talking about.
And now we're going to talk about something that might take us 2 hours if we're not careful. We'll try to make it into a bite size, but it's a big conversation I'm always having with Richard about high-risk food. What is a high-risk food? It's a word we always bandy around, but do we really know what it means, and is it comprehensive enough? So Richard, simple definition of high-risk food to you. What does it mean to you?
Right. High-risk foods are ready-to-eat foods, that's important, that support the multiplication of food poisoning bacteria, and are those foods that are most often implicated as food vehicles in food poisoning outbreaks. So those are the three of the characteristics. They should be always stored under refrigeration.
Can you give me a couple examples, Richard, just to make sure we all know what we're talking about?
Yeah, cooked chicken would be one. Cream cakes, cream would be another one. Shellfish, including raw oysters, are another one. So these are the high-risk foods that we're talking about. Those that you store in the refrigeration, usually, or we used to call them cooked foods, but that definition wasn't wide enough. So there's more things now because, as I've said, oysters are a high-risk food and they're not cooked. So that's why we brought in the term high-risk food in all our food safety training.
Richard is smiling there. I've had a long life addiction to raw oysters that Richard can't understand, and is always convincing me that I should either cook them or give them up. But I am an addict, I can tell you, Richard. Richard, so let's talk about food poisoning then. So obviously, if it's a high-risk food, you'd expect to see it high in the table of causes of food poisoning. And as we've seen in the States and we're seeing elsewhere, that actually we've got cantaloupes that have got salmonella in, that we've seen massive outbreaks of listeria in the States in green salads. But would a green salad, would a fruit and salad be in your high-risk food category? You certainly wouldn't cook them, so they're ready to eat, aren't they?
They're ready to eat, and certainly a cut melon. So this is the important thing. The cut melon is a high-risk food. So it means once it's cut, it's got to be stored under refrigeration to stop the multiplication of the pathogens that have been transferred from the surface skin into the actual flesh, which hasn't got sufficient pH to stop the multiplication. So that's a high-risk food. Lettuce, we take lettuces, especially in the UK, we take them from either the producer or the greenhouse, and they're not under temperature control. They don't need to be because pathogens don't multiply rapidly. Once we get them and prepare them as a salad, once they're prepared and cut, then they're classified as high-risk food and have to be stored under refrigeration. It's the same as tomatoes. A whole tomato, you'll see it in the shops, not stored under refrigeration in the retail store, but once you cut it, then it's got to be stored under refrigeration to prevent any potential multiplication, and it's a high-risk food.
Yeah, because in the past, when we talked about high-risk food, if we looked at a burger, our natural instinct is, oh, it's the meat, isn't it? That we should be thinking about E. coli, we should make sure it's thoroughly cooked. But if you lived in the States, the risk could come from the lettuce as much as the meat, you could argue. So new types of high-risk foods as new things develop. Let me give another one, Richard. So we know about food hypersensitivity and allergic reactions, and there's a certain proportion of our population that are very sensitive. You could argue milk, the thing that gives us health, that I drink a gallon of a day, literally. There are some people that it's a high-risk food to. So does high risk relate to the group? If you've got a milk allergy, most popular allergy, and people do die from it, is milk a high-risk food then for some people?
Right. In terms of allergens, the risk classification is about multiplication of bacteria, essentially. So the allergens don't come into the definition of high-risk foods. In terms of milk itself, milk is a high-risk food, and obviously it's a dangerous food when it's raw and not cooked. But whether it's raw or whether it's pasteurized, you store it in the fridge and you deal with it as a high-risk food. The interesting thing is, do you know how they define high-risk foods in the States, or what their classification?
How do they define it? How do they define it in the States and maybe the Middle East where you're based?
No, these states, they define it as potentially hazardous foods. And a lot of people get the two confused because potentially hazardous foods only considers one of the hazards. There are two main hazards that we're looking at: cross-contamination, and we're looking at multiplication. The definition in the States for potentially hazardous foods effectively is any food that supports the rapid multiplication of the pathogens. It doesn't take account of the cross-contamination. So therefore, in our refrigerators in the UK, we would store high-risk foods such as cooked chicken separately from raw chicken. So the raw chicken would be stored at the bottom of the refrigerator if you've got a single refrigerator, and the cooked chicken would be stored at the top. In the States, they don't differentiate between raw chicken and cooked chicken because they only concentrate, their definition is on potentially hazardous foods. And I find that a bit concerning because we know that a lot of food poisoning is caused by cross-contamination.
So there's some food for thought, and you can see what Richard and I talk about when we have lunch together, and we can go on for hours. But it is an interesting way of looking at food safety and what is a high-risk food. And sometimes it's about inherently what's in the food. It could be the way that it's been processed. And as I say, things are developing quite rapidly into what types of food might pose a hazard. When you look at the epidemiology, some of those foods that are causing food poisoning aren't ones that you would naturally think of as high risk or present a high hazard. So once again, Richard, thank you so much for your insight, especially from the States. I hadn't realized that. Guys, keep an eye out for others in our Bitesize series if you want a quick 5 minutes on a subject. If there's a subject that you want us to talk about, please drop us a line on the Highfield site and we'll do our very best to cover it. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks,
Goodbye,
Sterling.
everyone.
Bye.